He reached the hall before sunrise, just like he did every day. The streets were still quiet, and the air carried that soft chill that comes before the city wakes up. His shoes made a faint sound on the pavement as he walked, a sound he had grown used to over the years. Nothing about his life was loud or noticeable. He preferred it that way, or at least that's what he told himself. The building stood tall ahead of him, its glass doors reflecting the pale morning light. It was one of the most beautiful halls in the city, known for hosting grand events, weddings, and high-profile gatherings. People dressed in expensive clothes came here, people who laughed loudly and spoke with confidence. He had seen them all, but from a distance. He was never part of their world. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The silence wrapped around him immediately. At this hour, the hall felt different, almost peaceful. No music, no chatter, no rushing footsteps. Just empty space and stillness. He liked this version of the place. Felt honest. He placed his small bag in the corner near the storage room and picked up his cleaning tools. The routine was always the same. Sweep the floors, wipe the surfaces, arrange the chairs, and make sure everything looked perfect before anyone important arrived. His work was invisible but necessary. If he did it right, no one noticed. If he made a mistake, everyone would. He started with the main entrance, moving the broom slowly across the polished floor. The sound was soft, almost calming. As he worked, his eyes occasionally drifted toward the stage at the far end of the hall. It stood slightly elevated, covered in rich fabric, with elegant lights hanging above it. And there, right at the center, was the piano. It was always there, shining under the lights, untouched at this hour. A grand piano, black and smooth, like something out of a dream. He had seen it many times, but it never lost its effect on him. Even from a distance, it pulled his attention. He tried not to look at it too much. There was work to do, and he knew his place. But something about that piano always made it difficult to focus. He finished sweeping the entrance and moved deeper into the hall. Rows of chairs were neatly arranged, but he checked them anyway, adjusting a few that were slightly out of line. His hands worked automatically, guided by habit. His mind, however, was somewhere else. It often went back to moments he never spoke about. Moments from years ago when life felt a little different. When there was still time for small dreams. He remembered the first time he saw a piano up close. It wasn't in a grand hall like this. It was in a small community center, slightly worn out, with chipped edges and uneven keys. He had been much younger then, standing quietly in a corner while someone else played. He didn't understand the music, but he felt it. It stayed with him long after the sound had faded. After that day, something changed. He started noticing music everywhere, in the rhythm of footsteps, in the sound of rain, even in silence. It was like his mind had learned a new language. But life didn't leave much space for that kind of curiosity. Responsibilities came early. Work became necessary. And slowly, those quiet moments with music became rare. Still, the feeling never completely disappeared. He moved toward the stage area, his broom gliding across the floor. This part always took longer because he paid extra attention to detail. The stage had to look perfect. It was the center of everything. As he got closer, his steps slowed down. The piano was right there now, only a few feet away. Its surface reflected the lights above, and the keys looked almost untouched, waiting. He looked around instinctively, even though he knew no one else was there. The hall was still empty, just him and the silence. He leaned the broom gently against the side of the stage. For a moment he just stood there. There was always that small hesitation, that quiet question in his mind. Should he or shouldn't he? He had told himself many times to stop. It wasn't his job. It wasn't his place. If someone saw him, it could cause trouble. But every time he stood this close, those thoughts became weaker. He slowly stepped onto the stage. His footsteps were careful, almost respectful, as if he didn't want to disturb something important. When he reached the piano, he paused again. His reflection stared back at him from the glossy surface. Simple clothes, slightly tired eyes, nothing remarkable. He placed his fingers lightly on the edge of the piano. It was cool to the touch. Another glance around the hall. Still empty. He took a quiet breath and sat down on the bench. For a few seconds he didn't move. His hands rested on his lap, and his shoulders were slightly tense. It had been a long time since he last played anything properly. Life had a way of taking time away from things that mattered. Slowly, he lifted his hands and placed them on the keys. The first note was soft, almost hesitant. It echoed gently through the empty hall. He froze for a second, listening. There was something about hearing that sound in such a large space. It felt bigger than him, bigger than the moment. He pressed another key, then another. This time, his fingers moved with a bit more confidence. The notes started to connect, forming something familiar. Not a full song, not something perfect, but enough to bring back that old feeling. His shoulders relaxed slightly. As he continued, the music began to flow more naturally. His fingers moved across the keys, not perfectly, but with emotion. Each note carried a small piece of something he couldn't explain. It wasn't about skill. It was about feeling. The hall, once silent, was now filled with a gentle melody. For those few minutes, everything else faded away. The early mornings, the long hours, the feeling of being invisible, it all disappeared. There was only the music. He didn't notice how much time had passed. A faint sound from the entrance suddenly broke the moment. He quickly pulled his hands away from the keys. His heart started to beat faster. He stood up immediately, stepping back from the piano. His eyes moved toward the entrance, trying to see who had come in. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to remind him where he was. Without wasting a second, he picked up his broom and stepped off the stage. He returned to his work as if nothing had happened. A few moments later, another worker walked in, greeting him casually. He nodded in response, keeping his focus on the floor. There was no sign that anything unusual had taken place. But inside him, something still lingered. The feeling of those few minutes didn't disappear so easily. He continued working, moving from one section of the hall to another. Chairs were adjusted, surfaces were cleaned. Everything was brought into order. By the time the sun had fully risen, the hall looked ready for the day. People would arrive soon. The quiet would be replaced by noise, laughter, and busy footsteps. The piano would be played, but not by him. It would belong to someone else, someone expected, someone recognized. And he would go back to being part of the background. But as he finished his work and stood near the exit, he couldn't help but look back at the stage one more time. The piano sat there, just as it always did. Still silent, waiting. He didn't smile, but there was a small change in his expression. Something subtle, almost unnoticeable. Because deep inside, he knew something others didn't. That piano wasn't just an object on a stage. For him, it was a quiet reminder that even in a life filled with routine, there was still a part of him that hadn't been forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, it was waiting for the right moment to be heard. By late morning, the quiet hall had completely changed its mood. The stillness from earlier was gone, replaced by movement, voices, and a sense of urgency that filled every corner of the space. Staff members walked quickly from one side to another, carrying decorations, checking lists, and speaking in low but hurried tones. Today was not an ordinary day. It was one of the biggest events the hall had hosted in a long time. He stood near the side wall, holding a cloth in his hand, carefully wiping the surface of a long table. From where he was, he could see almost everything. The stage, the entrance, and the rows of chairs that were now being adjusted again, even though he had already set them perfectly earlier. It didn't bother him. He had learned that in places like this, things were always being changed, even at the last minute. A group of event organizers stood near the stage, discussing something with serious expressions. Their voices were not loud, but their body language showed pressure. One of them kept checking his watch again and again. Another was speaking on the phone, walking back and forth in short steps. He didn't try to listen, but bits of their conversation still reached him. Everything has to be perfect. Guests will start arriving by evening. Make sure the lighting is checked again. These words floated in the air, mixing with the sound of footsteps and shifting chairs. He moved to another table, continuing his work quietly. No one paid attention to him, and he preferred it that way. Being unnoticed meant he could do his job without interruptions. As he wiped the surface, his eyes slowly lifted toward the stage again. The piano was still there, but now it looked different. Bright lights had been adjusted above it, making it shine even more. A decorative arrangement had been placed nearby, giving the stage a more elegant look. Everything was being prepared for something important. He watched as a technician tested the microphone stand beside the piano. Another person checked the sound system, tapping lightly and adjusting controls. Every small detail was being handled with care. For a moment, he wondered who would play today. It had to be someone special. Events like this didn't leave space for mistakes. He lowered his eyes and continued cleaning. Around noon, more workers arrived. The hall became even busier. Large boxes were brought in, filled with decorations and supplies. Fresh flowers were arranged along the sides, adding color and fragrance to the space. The smell slowly spread through the hall, mixing with the faint scent of polish and wood. He helped move a few chairs when asked, then returned to his usual tasks. He didn't speak much, only nodding when someone gave him instructions. His presence was simple, quiet, and easy to overlook. At one point, he stepped outside for a short break. The sun was higher now, and the street was no longer empty. People passed by, cars moved along, and life outside felt completely different from the controlled environment inside the hall. He leaned against the wall for a moment, taking a slow breath. Days like this were always longer. After a few minutes, he went back inside. The energy had only increased. Near the stage, a small group had gathered again. This time, their conversation sounded slightly different. There was a hint of concern in their voices. The pianist confirmed, right? Yes, he should be here by evening. Make sure someone is ready to receive him. The words caught his attention even though he kept his head down. So, there was a pianist coming. That made sense. He moved closer to the stage area, pretending to check the floor while quietly observing. He didn't want to be obvious. He had learned how to blend into his surroundings without drawing attention. One of the organizers opened a folder and checked some details. His performance is the main highlight, he said. Everything depends on this. Another nodded. We can't afford any delay. He stepped back slightly, giving them space. The main highlight. That meant all eyes would be on that stage tonight. He imagined the hall filled with people, the lights dimmed, and the piano standing under a soft spotlight. He imagined someone sitting there confidently, playing without hesitation, without fear, felt far from his world. He picked up his cloth again and moved away. The afternoon passed with the same rhythm. Work, movement, small instructions, and constant preparation. Time seemed to move faster inside the hall. There was always something to fix, something to adjust. At one point, he was asked to clean the stage again. Footprints had appeared from all the activity, and it needed to be spotless before the final setup. He nodded and stepped onto the stage carefully. Being on the stage during the day felt different. People were around, and he had to focus only on his task. Still, standing there gave him a strange feeling. It was the same place he had sat earlier that morning, but now it felt distant. He started sweeping slowly, making sure not to disturb anything. As he worked, he avoided looking directly at the piano. It was easier that way, less distraction. But even without looking, he could feel its presence. After finishing, he stepped down and continued with other tasks. By late afternoon, the hall was almost ready. The decorations were complete, the chairs were aligned, and the stage looked perfect. Soft lighting filled the space, giving it a warm and welcoming glow. The organizers seemed slightly more relaxed now, though the tension hadn't completely disappeared. Guests would start arriving soon. He moved toward the back area, putting away some cleaning supplies. His work for the day was nearly done. After this, he would either be asked to stay for minor tasks or be allowed to leave early, depending on the situation. He didn't mind either way. As he arranged the tools, he heard footsteps approaching. One of the staff members stopped nearby. "Make sure you're around," the man said. "There might be small things later." He nodded. "Okay." The man left without another word. He sat down for a moment on a small chair near the storage area. His body felt slightly tired, but his mind was still active. Days like this always brought a different kind of energy, something he couldn't fully explain. After a short rest, he stood up again. Something pulled him back toward the main hall. He walked slowly, not in a hurry, just observing. The place looked completely different now. It was no longer just a workspace. It had turned into something elegant, almost magical. Soft music played lightly in the background, setting the mood. He stopped near the side, watching quietly. The stage looked ready. The piano stood at the center, waiting. For a brief moment, the thought crossed his mind again. What it would feel like to sit there tonight, in front of everyone. But he quickly pushed it away. That wasn't his role. He turned his attention elsewhere, focusing on small details that still needed attention. As evening approached, the first few guests began to arrive. Their voices filled the hall, bringing life to the carefully prepared space. Laughter, greetings, and polite conversations echoed around him. He stepped further back, making sure he stayed out of the way. The event had begun, and somewhere in the middle of all this, he remained what he had always been in this place. Someone who prepared the stage but never stood on it. Still, as he looked one more time toward the piano, there was a quiet thought that stayed with him. Sometimes, the most unexpected moments come without warning. And tonight, something about the air felt slightly different, as if the story of the stage was not going to go exactly as planned. The hall slowly filled with people as the evening approached. What was once a quiet, empty space had now turned into a lively world of sound and color. Soft lights glowed above, reflecting off polished floors and shining decorations. Guests arrived in elegant clothing, speaking in calm but confident voices. Every step they took carried a sense of importance, as if this place belonged to them for the night. He stood near the side wall again, just like he always did when events began. His job for now was simple: stay alert, assist when needed, and make sure nothing went out of place. He kept his hands folded in front of him, watching carefully as more people entered. The energy in the room was rising. Chairs that had been perfectly arranged were now being occupied one by one. Conversations grew louder. Soft laughter mixed with greetings. Cameras flashed near the entrance as a few important guests made their way inside. He moved quietly, adjusting a chair here, picking up a small piece of paper there. Nothing unusual. Everything was going according to plan. At least that is what it seemed like at first. Near the stage, the organizers were gathered again. But this time something was different. Their faces looked tighter. Their movements were faster. One of them kept looking toward the entrance repeatedly, checking the time again and again. He noticed it but didn't interfere. It wasn't his place to ask questions. Still, something in the air felt off. He continued his work, but his attention kept drifting toward the stage. The piano stood in the center, waiting under the soft lights. It looked calm, almost unaware of the tension building around it. A few minutes passed, then more. The hall was almost full now. The event was about to begin. A staff member walked quickly past him, speaking into a phone in a low voice. His expression was serious, almost worried. He stopped near the organizers and whispered something. That was when everything changed. He couldn't hear the exact words, but he saw the reaction immediately. One of the organizers froze. Another stepped back slightly. A third ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Something was wrong. He stayed where he was, but his eyes followed the group. Then came the movement. Quick, urgent steps. The organizers separated and began speaking to different staff members. Phones came out. Messages were sent. The calm structure of the evening started to crack. He felt it before he understood it. Something important was missing. He slowly moved closer, pretending to adjust a row of chairs near the aisle. Close enough to see, but far enough to not be noticed. He caught fragments of conversation. He hasn't arrived yet. No response from the contact number. We need to fix this quickly. Guests are already seated. The words didn't fully connect at first, but slowly the meaning became clear. The pianist. He wasn't there. A strange silence followed those thoughts in his mind. The main performance, the highlight of the evening, depended on someone who had not arrived. He looked toward the stage again. The piano suddenly felt heavier in the room, not physically, but in meaning. It was no longer just an instrument. It had become the center of pressure. The organizers were clearly panicking now, though they tried to hide it. One of them walked toward the backstage area, speaking urgently to someone. Another tried calling again, stepping away from the crowd. Guests, unaware of the situation, continued chatting and smiling. They had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. He stood still for a moment. This was not his problem. He knew that. His role was simple. Stay out of the way. Do the work. Leave quietly when the day ended. But something about the tension kept pulling his attention back. Minutes passed again. The hall lights dimmed slightly, signaling that the event was about to officially start. A microphone was tested on stage. Feedback echoed through the hall for a second, then stopped. The organizers gathered one last time. He was close enough now to hear clearly. He still hasn't arrived. We cannot delay much longer. If we cancel this, it will be embarrassing in front of everyone. A heavy pause followed. He saw one of them close his eyes briefly, thinking hard. Then came the decision that changed everything. Find another option. Those words were spoken quietly, but they carried weight. Another option. The staff around them looked at each other. No one spoke immediately. It was clear that there was no backup plan. The pianist was not just a performer for the evening. He was the main attraction. Without him, the entire program would fall apart. He felt a strange pressure in the air, even though no one was speaking directly to him. The organizers began looking around the hall, scanning faces, speaking to staff members quickly. Is there anyone who can play? Anyone at all? The question floated in the air like something impossible. Most people shook their heads. A few avoided eye contact. Panic was becoming visible now, no matter how hard they tried to control it. He stepped slightly back, trying to avoid being seen. But then, unexpectedly, one of the organizers turned in his direction. Their eyes met briefly. He looked away immediately, but it was too late. The organizer walked toward him. He felt his chest tighten slightly. The man stopped in front of him. You work here, right? He nodded. The man glanced toward the stage, then back at him. Do you know anyone who can play the piano? The question was simple, but the weight behind it was heavy. He hesitated. His mind went blank for a second. I don't know, he replied softly. The organizer sighed and looked around again, frustration growing. Then, almost as if speaking to himself, he said, we might have to delay everything. He turned away and started walking back. But another staff member quickly stopped him. There's no time for delay. Guests are already seated. Silence again. He stood there, watching everything unfold. The pressure was now visible on every face. The calm, organized atmosphere had completely changed. It felt like a system slowly breaking apart under expectations. He looked toward the piano again. It stood there silently, unchanged, unaware of the chaos building around it. For a brief moment, his thoughts drifted. He remembered the sound from earlier that day. The way the notes had filled the empty hall when no one was watching. The way it had felt, even if only for a short time. But he quickly pushed the thought away. That was not real. That was not for this moment. He lowered his eyes and stepped back further, trying to disappear into the background again. The organizers were now speaking faster, their voices overlapping. We need a solution. There is no one. This cannot happen. The event was seconds away from starting. The hall lights dimmed again. A signal. The audience began to settle. He could feel the shift in atmosphere. The moment of truth was approaching. And still, there was no pianist. He tightened his grip on the cloth in his hand without realizing it. Something was about to happen. Something unpredictable. And in that growing silence behind the curtain, the story of the evening was already starting to change in a way no one in the hall had expected. The hall had become unusually quiet, even though it was full of people. That kind of silence only happens when something important is about to begin. Guests had settled into their seats, soft conversations fading into whispers, and all eyes slowly turned toward the stage. The lighting had been adjusted to a gentle glow, giving everything a calm and elegant atmosphere. From the outside, everything still looked perfect. But behind the stage, the reality was very different. He stood near the side again, half hidden between a curtain and a stack of equipment cases. His job usually kept him away from attention, but today it felt harder to stay unnoticed. Something in the air had changed. The earlier panic among the organizers had not fully disappeared. Instead, it had turned into a quieter, heavier kind of stress. Phones were still being checked. Short conversations were still happening in rushed tones. One person kept walking back and forth near the backstage entrance, clearly waiting for news that had not come. The pianist still hadn't arrived. That fact was now impossible to ignore. He tried to focus on his tasks. He adjusted a chair, checked a cable lying near the floor, picked up a small piece of paper and placed it in the bin. Simple actions, familiar actions. Things that kept his hands busy so his mind wouldn't drift too far. But no matter how much he tried, his attention kept returning to the stage. The piano was still there, waiting. It had not moved. It had not changed. But now it felt different. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the silence around it. Maybe it was the expectation building in the room. Or maybe it was something inside him that he had always tried to ignore. A staff member rushed past him and stopped near the organizers. "We are out of time," the man said quickly, his voice low but sharp. "We have to start now or we lose control of the program." Another voice replied immediately, tense and uncertain. "Start with what? The main performance is missing." Pause followed. That pause said more than words. He stood still, watching from a distance. This was the moment where everything could fall apart. The event had already started in the minds of the guests. They were waiting, watching, expecting something special. And the most important part was missing. The organizers gathered again, forming a tight circle near the backstage area. Their expressions were serious, almost exhausted. One of them rubbed his forehead slowly, clearly trying to think under pressure. He caught fragments of their conversation again. "If we skip it, people will notice. We cannot just cancel the highlight. Think of something, anything." But there was nothing left to think about. The pianist had not arrived, and no one had a replacement. A silence spread through the group. Then came a moment that changed everything. One of the organizers suddenly turned slightly toward the side, scanning the backstage area. His eyes moved across the staff, the technicians, the assistants, and then landed on him. He noticed it immediately. For a second, he hoped it was just a passing glance. But it wasn't. The man walked toward him. Slow steps, purposeful. He felt something tighten in his chest, though he didn't understand why. The man stopped in front of him. He looked him up and down briefly, as if trying to remember something. "You've been working here all day," the man said. He nodded quietly. There was a short pause. Then the question came. "Do you know how to play?" The words were simple, but they didn't make sense at first. He blinked once. I just work here," he replied carefully. The man didn't step back. Instead, he looked more focused. "We don't have the pianist," he said quickly. "He hasn't arrived. We need someone, anyone, who can play something." The words hung in the air. He felt his mind slow down for a moment. This was not supposed to involve him. He was not part of this. He had never been part of anything like this. But the man was still looking at him, waiting. Behind them, another organizer stepped closer. "There is no backup," that voice added. "We either start or we risk losing the entire program." He suddenly became aware of how loud his heartbeat felt. He looked toward the stage without meaning to. The piano was still there. The lights above it were soft, calm, almost inviting. For a brief second, he remembered the sound from earlier that day. The empty hall, the silence, the way the notes had felt like they belonged somewhere he had never been allowed to stay. But that was different. That was private. That was hidden. This This was in front of everyone. He shook his head slightly. I am not a performer, he said quietly. The organizer didn't respond immediately. Instead, another voice cut in. We don't have time, the second man said. If you can play even a little, it is better than nothing. A difficult silence followed. He looked at them, unsure what to say. He could feel the weight of the situation now. It wasn't just about music. It was about expectations, reputation, and a room full of people waiting for something that had not arrived. Still, he hesitated. I don't know if I can, he said honestly. The first organizer exhaled sharply, frustrated but controlled. No one here knows, he said. But we have no choice. He took a small step back. The pressure felt heavier now. From the hall, soft applause suddenly began. The program had officially started without the main act. A speaker was likely on stage trying to fill time, talking to the audience, keeping them engaged. But it was only delaying the truth. Eventually, silence would return, and then questions would follow. He looked again at the piano. It felt closer now, even though he hadn't moved. One of the staff members spoke quietly nearby. If we fail tonight, this event will be remembered for the wrong reason. That sentence stayed in his mind. He was still just a worker here. Someone who cleaned, arranged, and disappeared when needed. That was the role he understood. But something about the situation didn't feel like it belonged only to them anymore. The organizer in front of him softened his tone slightly. Please, he said. We just need something. Anything. Even a short piece. The word please changed the feeling in the air. He looked down for a moment. His hands were slightly tense. He wasn't prepared for this. Not at all. Not even close. But the silence from the stage grew louder in his mind than anything else. He thought about stepping away, about saying no again, about returning to his usual place in the background where nothing unexpected happened. But his feet didn't move. Instead, he looked toward the stage one more time. The piano, still waiting, still silent. And for the first time that day, the thought appeared in his mind without being pushed away immediately. What if? Not confidence. Not certainty, just a small question. What if he tried? Behind him, the organizer spoke again, more urgently now. We need an answer. The audience outside was waiting. The program could not hold the silence much longer. And in that moment, standing between responsibility and something he had buried for years, he made a decision that even he did not fully understand yet. He slowly lifted his eyes and took a quiet step toward the stage. He didn't fully understand the moment when he started walking forward. It wasn't a confident decision, and it wasn't something he had planned. It felt more like a quiet push from inside, something he couldn't explain with clear thoughts. One step followed another, and before he realized it, he was no longer standing near the backstage wall. The organizers looked at him in silence for a second. There was surprise in their faces, mixed with relief and doubt at the same time. No one stopped him immediately. No one encouraged him strongly either. It was as if everyone was afraid to say the wrong thing. He stopped briefly near the edge of the stage. The piano was now fully visible in front of him. It looked different up close. Stronger, heavier, more real. The soft light above it made the black surface shine gently. The empty space around it felt larger than before, like it was waiting for something important to happen. Behind him, a voice spoke quickly. You are sure about this? He didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure about anything. But the silence behind him felt heavier than his doubt. He gave a small nod. Not confident. Not proud. Just a quiet acceptance. One of the staff members guided him toward the piano bench. It felt strange walking onto the stage in front of so many people. Even though the audience wasn't fully aware of what was happening yet, he could feel their attention slowly shifting. Something was changing. He sat down. The bench felt colder than expected. For a moment, he kept his hands still in his lap. The hall was large, and even though people were talking softly, it still felt like a distant hum. From this position, everything looked slightly different. The lights, the decorations, the rows of seated guests. It all felt like another world. And in the center of it, he sat alone. His eyes lowered to the piano keys. They looked clean and untouched. Waiting. His fingers slowly lifted and hovered above them, but didn't press anything yet. For a brief moment, fear came back. Not loud, just quiet. What if he made a mistake? What if he froze? What if people laughed? He had never played like this before. Not in front of anyone. Not under lights. Not with an audience that expected something meaningful. Behind him, someone in the staff whispered, "We are out of time." That small sentence removed the last bit of delay. He took a slow breath and pressed the first key. The sound that came out was soft, almost uncertain. It echoed through the hall gently. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then he pressed another key, and another. Slowly, carefully, the sound started to connect. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't planned. But it was real. The hall, which had been filled with low conversation, started to quiet down. People began noticing that something different was happening. Heads turned slightly toward the stage. He didn't look at them. His focus stayed on the keys. His hands moved a little more freely now. Not fast. Not impressive. Just steady. Like someone trying to remember something from a long time ago. The notes were simple at first. Then slowly they began to form a pattern. A melody that wasn't fully structured but carried emotion. Something in it felt familiar even to him. He didn't think about the audience anymore. The fear didn't disappear completely, but it moved to the back of his mind. For the first time that evening, the hall felt silent in a different way. Not the silence of panic, but the silence of attention. People were now fully watching. The staff behind the stage also became still. Even those who had doubted him earlier were now focused on the sound coming from the piano. His fingers continued moving. A little more confident now. A little more connected. He wasn't performing like a professional. But he wasn't just playing randomly either. Something in between had formed. A kind of natural flow. He didn't notice when the first emotional shift happened in the audience. A few people leaned forward slightly. Some stopped whispering completely. The sound was not loud, but it carried in a way that filled the space. It was not about speed or complexity. It was about feeling. His shoulders slowly relaxed without him realizing it. The piano no longer felt like an object in front of him. It felt like a place he had somehow returned to. The memory of earlier that morning came back for a brief second. The empty hall, the quiet space, the hidden moment when he had first touched the keys. But this time, there was no interruption. Only continuation. The melody grew slightly stronger. Not perfect, but deeper. It carried something that people could not ignore. In the audience, expressions began to change. Confusion turned into curiosity. Curiosity slowly turned into attention. And attention slowly turned into emotion. No one was speaking now. Even those who had been distracted were fully looking at the stage. He didn't see their faces clearly. He didn't need to. His world had narrowed down to sound and movement. Each note guided the next. His hands were no longer shaking as much. They were still not fully steady, but they were no longer afraid either. Time felt strange. He didn't know how many minutes had passed. Could have been seconds. Could have been longer. The hall seemed to breathe differently now. Soft silence between the notes. Then sound again. Then silence again. A rhythm formed not just in music, but in the room itself. Behind him, the organizers stood frozen. They had expected a failure. They had expected confusion. But what they were witnessing now didn't match either expectation. It was something unexpected. Something unplanned. The piano was no longer just part of the program. It had become the center of the entire event. His fingers moved a little faster now, not out of pressure, but out of flow. The sound changed slightly. More emotion came through. Not loud emotion, but deep, like something that had been held inside for a long time. A few people in the audience exchanged quiet looks. Some nodded slightly without speaking. Others simply watched, fully absorbed. He still did not look up. If he had, he might have lost his focus. So he stayed with the keys, with the sound, with the moment. The melody began to rise gently, then soften again, like waves. Not dramatic, but natural. The piano responded to him in a way he did not expect, as if it was no longer separate from him. The hall, which had once been filled with doubt and tension, now felt completely different. Something had shifted, and no one could ignore it anymore. He didn't know what people were thinking. He didn't know what would happen after. He didn't even know if he was doing it correctly. But for the first time that night, none of that mattered. Because in that moment, the sound he was creating had already begun to speak louder than anything else in the room. The hall had changed completely, even though nothing physical about it had moved. The lights were still in the same place, the chairs were still aligned in neat rows, and the decorations were still glowing softly. But the feeling inside the room was no longer the same. What started as confusion had now turned into complete attention. Every person present was focused on the stage. No one was speaking. No one was distracted. Even the smallest movement felt noticeable in the silence that had formed. On the stage, he continued to play. His hands moved with a rhythm that felt more natural now. It was no longer hesitant. The earlier uncertainty had slowly faded, replaced by something steadier. He was still not thinking about perfection. He was not thinking about technique. He was simply following the sound. Each note led to the next. Each moment followed the one before it. It felt less like performing and more like remembering something that had always been there. The melody filled the hall gently, but completely. It wasn't loud in a forceful way. It was present in a way that made people stop and listen without realizing they had stopped everything else. Somewhere in the audience, a few guests leaned forward slightly in their seats. Others had their hands resting still, as if even small movements might break the moment. A few people closed their eyes briefly, letting the sound settle in. No one expected this. No one had planned for this. The organizers, who had been tense just moments ago, now stood completely still behind the stage area. Their earlier panic had turned into silence. There was no need for words anymore. Whatever problem had existed before no longer mattered in the same way. The piano had taken control of the evening. He, however, remained unaware of all this. For him, the world had narrowed to something very simple. Keys, sound, breath, repeat. He didn't see the audience clearly. He didn't see their expressions changing. He didn't see the way the hall was reacting to every note. He was focused inward, staying with the music as if it was guiding him forward step by step. There were moments when his fingers slowed slightly, as if searching for the next sound. And then there were moments when the flow returned again, smoother than before. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that honesty carried through the entire hall. Time felt strange. It was hard to tell how long he had been playing. A few minutes felt like much longer, or maybe much shorter. The sense of time was no longer clear. The audience stayed silent throughout. Not because they were asked to, but because they didn't want to break what they were witnessing. Something had shifted in the atmosphere that no announcement or explanation could replace. The piano was no longer just part of the program. It had become the center of everything. At the side of the stage, one of the organizers slowly lowered his head, exhaling deeply. The tension that had been building for hours was slowly releasing. Not because the problem was solved in the way they expected, but because something unexpected had taken its place. Another staff member whispered quietly, almost in disbelief, "This is not what we planned." But there was no frustration in the words anymore. Only surprise. The melody on stage began to rise slightly, then soften again, like waves moving in and out. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't dramatic. It was controlled in a way that felt natural, even though it had not come from a trained performer. Came from feeling, from memory, from something deeper than preparation. In the audience, an elderly guest tilted their head slightly, watching carefully. A younger guest nearby had stopped scrolling on their phone without even realizing it. Another person gently placed both hands together, not clapping, just holding still. No one wanted to interrupt. The hall felt like it was holding its breath. On stage, his shoulders had now fully relaxed. The initial tension was gone. His fingers were moving with more confidence, even though he was still not thinking in technical terms. He wasn't following rules. He was following instinct. A simple pattern formed in the music, then changed, then returned. It wasn't predictable, but it felt complete. The piano responded in a way that made the sound feel alive. Behind the curtain, someone slowly stepped closer to watch more clearly. Even those who had doubted the situation earlier were now fully focused on what was happening. There were no more instructions being shouted. No more urgent calls. Everything had paused, because something else had taken over. He did not notice the change in energy behind him. He was still inside the music, but something in him was also changing. There was a quiet strength forming, not from confidence in front of people, but from the simple act of continuing. Even when uncertain, even when unprepared, even when nothing around him suggested he should be there. The notes became slightly deeper, slightly more expressive. The melody carried a softness that felt human, not mechanical. And the audience responded to that without needing explanation. A few people wiped their eyes quietly, not making a scene. Others simply stared, fully absorbed in what they were hearing. It wasn't just music anymore. It felt like a moment that didn't belong to one person alone. It belonged to the room, to everyone in it, to the silence between the notes as much as the notes themselves. Slowly, the piece began to move toward its final section. The sound softened. The pace slowed slightly. There was a sense of closing, not ending abruptly, but gently stepping down from something higher. His hands moved with more care now. Each note was placed with attention. Each pause carried meaning. The hall remained completely quiet. Even the smallest sounds, like a chair shifting slightly, felt distant. He played the final few notes carefully. Not rushed, not forced, just steady. And then, slowly, the last sound faded into silence. For a moment nothing happened. No applause, no movement, just silence. A deep, complete silence that felt heavier than any sound before it. He kept his hands on the keys for a second longer, as if unsure whether it was truly over. Then he gently lifted them and lowered them into his lap. Still, the audience didn't react immediately. It was as if they were waiting for something more, as if the moment itself needed time to settle. Then, slowly, the first clap began. Just one person, then another, then more, until the entire hall filled with applause. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew quickly, filling every corner of the space. People stood up from their seats. Some clapped continuously. Some simply watched the stage with expressions of surprise and admiration. He looked up for the first time. The brightness of the lights made it slightly difficult to see clearly, but he could still notice movement. People standing, people clapping, people focused entirely on him. For a moment he didn't move. It didn't feel real. The organizers behind the stage also stepped forward now, looking at him differently than before. There was no doubt in their expressions anymore. Only realization. Something unexpected had happened. Something that no one had planned for. And yet, it had become the most important part of the evening. He slowly stood up from the bench, still unsure how to respond. The applause continued. He gave a small, uncertain nod, not as a performer, not as someone expecting attention, but as someone who had simply been part of a moment he didn't fully understand. As he stepped back from the piano, he looked at it one last time. It was the same instrument that had been sitting quietly all day, but now it felt different, not because it had changed, but because something had been revealed through it. And as he walked slowly off the stage, still surrounded by applause, one quiet truth remained in the air. Some moments in life do not arrive with warning. They begin quietly, and change everything without asking permission.